Hi everyone, welcome back. Tonight we're stepping into a winter night where the air bites your lungs the moment you breathe, and the snow squeaks under your boots like dry chalk as you cross a clearing toward a log cabin whose walls are already frosting over, while the sky dims fast and a storm quietly gathers its strength. And before we go any further, take a second to like the video, and subscribe only if you genuinely enjoy what we do here. And if you're awake somewhere in the world right now, tell me where you are and what time it is, then dim the lights, get comfortable, and let your shoulders loosen as we step fully inside. You lift the latch and the door gives a reluctant little groan, and when it swings inward you feel the wind soften rather than disappear, like an animal that has stopped at the threshold but hasn't gone away. And the cabin is small, thick logs stacked by hands that knew winter would arrive whether they were ready or not. And you can see how quickly it was built in the rough corners, the uneven joins, the floor that is more packed earth than wood, because a quiet historical truth settles into your thoughts right away. Many frontier cabins were raised in late summer or early fall, in a matter of days, sometimes with neighbours helping in a rush, because the first hard freeze could arrive without warning, and speed mattered more than comfort. And you can feel that priority in everything your eyes touch. Your breath clouds the dim interior, and the room smells of smoke-stained wood, dampness, and something faintly animal, not unpleasant, just honest. And at one end, there's a hearth blackened by past fires, the kind of hearth that isn't decoration or nostalgia, but a tool, a hinge on which life turns, and you walk toward it and press your palm near the stones, and they are cold enough to make you flinch, and for a moment you can hear the storm finding the cabin's weaknesses, the way water finds cracks, with snow tapping the roof in irregular rhythms and wind sliding along the walls, and you realize this night isn't about romance, it's about tiny decisions that decide whether sleep will be merely uncomfortable or quietly dangerous. You look at the chinking between the logs, and its patchwork, clay and straw and whatever could be scavenged, and in places it has cracked and fallen away, so that cold air slips in like thin fingers. And here's one of those quirky details that rarely makes it into tidy summaries. Some settlers mixed ash, moss, or even animal hair into their chinking, because they believed it helped the filler bind, trap more air, and resist pests, and whether every mixture truly worked is still argued over. But you don't need a debate tonight to understand the principle, because trapped air is warmth, and any gap you can close is a small victory you can feel in your bones. Along one wall there's a rough sleeping platform built from split logs laid side by side, and when you sit on it the wood complains under your weight. And there's no mattress waiting for you, only the promise of what you can arrange, blankets, hides, maybe a sack of straw if you're lucky. And beneath you the ground is frozen and stubborn, pulling heat upward and away from you, as if it has all night to take what it wants, and the modern part of your brain tries to object, because surely people didn't sleep like this night after night. But then the older part of your mind answers, calmly and without drama they did, because the alternative was worse, and because winter is not negotiated with, it is managed. So you begin managing, slowly, deliberately, the way people always did when the storm started to press, and you move back to the walls and test a seam with your fingertips, and you can feel the whisper of a draft, not strong, just steady, the kind that steals warmth while you think you're resting, and you gather what you have, stiff clay, dry grass saved from autumn, scraps of cloth worn thin long before tonight, and you push the material into the gaps with a stick when your fingers protest, and it becomes oddly repetitive, almost meditative, because pioneers learned quickly that sealing a cabin wasn't a one-time task, but a constant winter habit. Since green logs shrank and twisted, gaps opened where none existed before, and the cabin breathed as it warmed and cooled, so what held last week might fail tonight. Outside, the wind rises and falls as if testing your resolve, and inside the cabin answers with soft creaks and low groans as wood rubs against wood, and the first time you hear it your chest tightens, but then you realize something that settlers learned fast. A living structure makes noise, and silence can be worse, because silence might mean something has already snapped, and you keep working, packing, smoothing, stepping back, listening, and every time the whistle of a draft dulls, the space feels slightly more contained, not warm yet, but less exposed, as if you've negotiated a better truce. You don't chase perfection because nobody out here had perfection. They had enough, and you wedge a rolled strip of fabric along the bottom of the door where the cold likes to crawl in, and it looks crude, but it works, and you make a note for later that the floor will matter too, because packed earth pulls heat relentlessly, and many families layered evergreen boughs, bark, straw, or hides under the sleeping area, not for comfort but to slow that upward theft of warmth. And you can already feel how your knees ache when you kneel, how the cold presses through your clothes like a patient hand, and you understand why so many winter nights were won, not through heroics but through small, stubborn tasks done carefully and without complaint. And when the worst drafts are slowed, only slowed, never defeated, you finally turn toward the hearth, because now the cabin is ready for the next step, and you can feel the moment the night changes from barely shelter to possible, and you kneel close to the blackened stones, arrange kindling the way someone taught you, or the way you learned by failing once, and you hesitate just long enough to remember that fire will save you and threaten you in the same breath, and that pioneers lived with that double truth every winter, every storm, every night, and then you strike the match. The tiny flame appears, fragile but determined, and it catches the shavings, and then the twigs, and then it starts to lick at the first small sticks, and the smell of cold wood gives way to the first warm breath of smoke and resin, and heat doesn't arrive like a gift. It arrives like a slow animal stepping cautiously into the room, touching your hands and face first, and you feed it carefully because wood is time, and time is survival, and burning too fast is the same kind of mistake as not burning at all. And as the fire settles into a steadier rhythm, you notice how the entire cabin starts to sound different. The wind's still loud outside, but no longer the only voice, because now you have a second rhythm, human-made, crackle and pop and ember shift, answering the storm, refusing to be drowned out. And this is where Party 1 truly begins, because once the fire is alive, the real pioneer question arrives, quiet and relentless, like the wind itself. How do you turn this little island of heat into actual sleep? When the roof is loaded with snow, the walls are never fully sealed, the air can turn smoky without warning, and your body has to rest without surrendering its vigilance. So you sit there for a moment, watching the ember glow paint the low ceiling in amber pulsars, listening to the cabin breathe around you, and preparing to build the sleeping nest that will decide what kind of night you're about to have. You shift closer to the sleeping platform with the fire, now breathing steadily behind you, and immediately you feel how uneven the warmth is, your face and hands touched by it while your back and legs still live in the colder half of the room. And this imbalance is one of the first lessons pioneers learned about sleeping in log cabins during winter storms, because heat did not fill a space evenly the way it does in modern homes. It pooled and drifted and escaped, and if you wanted to sleep, truly sleep, you had to place your body with intention, not wherever it looked comfortable. You kneel and begin building the bed, the way countless people did before you, not as furniture, but as a layered system designed to slow the theft of warmth, first dragging evergreen branches across the platform, their needles dry and sharp and smelling faintly of sap, because branches trap air and lift you just enough to reduce contact with the cold wood beneath, then adding straw or dried grass if it's available, shaking it out so it doesn't clump, because clumps create cold pockets, and pioneers learned that uneven bedding was worse than thin bedding. And only after that do the heavier layers come, the hides and quilts and patched blankets, each one added carefully, not thrown, because once you lie down, rearranging costs warmth and effort you might not get back easily. As you work, the cabin keeps speaking, low creaks in the walls, a soft complaint from the roof as snow slides and settles again, and you find yourself listening automatically, learning which sounds mean nothing and which ones deserve attention, because early settlers slept with one ear open, not out of fear exactly, but out of habit. And diaries from winter settlements describe this state again and again: rest that was light but constant, sleep broken into pieces by the need to check the fire, to listen for changes, to feel whether the cold had found a new way in. You pause before lying down and look at the fire again, judging it not by size but by behaviour, by how the embers sit, by the sound of the burn, because people who survived many winters learned that roaring fires were wasteful and dangerous, while slow, banked fires were companions that lasted. And you use a flat stone to adjust airflow, lowering the flames just enough that they settle into a deep orange glow, the kind that promises hours rather than minutes. And you think about how pioneers often banked their fires with ash before sleep, covering embers so they smouldered instead of burned, a technique passed along not through manuals but through watching someone older do it right. Only then do you lie down, easing your body onto the platform slowly, because sudden movement forces cold air into places you just worked hard to warm. And immediately you feel the truth of frontier sleep in winter, that the surface beneath you does not yield kindly. It presses back, reminding you that rest here is not about comfort, but about endurance. And you adjust your position inch by inch, pulling a blanket under your shoulder, another beneath your hip, redistributing pressure the way people learn to do instinctively, because ignoring discomfort only guarantees waking later with worse problems. The cold rises from below like a quiet tide, and you feel it first along your spine and legs, so you turn slightly, angling your back toward the fire, knowing that pioneers often slept oriented to the hearth rather than facing it, letting heat soak into the largest muscles. And as you settle, the smell of smoke and animal and wood blends into something strangely grounding, not pleasant in a modern sense, but familiar enough to signal safety, shelter, and continuity. You breathe slowly, testing the air because smoke is always a concern, and even now you notice it drifting near the ceiling in darker bands, reminding you that early chimneys were imperfect things, built from sticks and clay that cracked with time and cold. And letters from the frontier describe nights spent half awake, coughing softly, adjusting logs, or briefly opening doors to clear the air despite the cold. And you understand now why pioneers often slept closer to the floor, where air was cleaner even though the cold was worse, because breathing came first, comfort second. As minutes pass, your body begins to relax, not fully, but enough, and the fire's rhythm becomes something you can lean on, a quiet pulse beneath the storm's voice, and outside the wind rises again, testing the cabin's corners, sliding along the logs, but inside the drafts are fewer now, dulled by your earlier work, and that small success changes everything, because even a slight reduction in airflow can mean the difference between numbness and tolerable cold. Your hands grow colder faster than the rest of you, and without opening your eyes fully you tuck them beneath your arms or between your thighs. Instinctive movements people developed long before they understood heat loss scientifically. And you think about how frostbite often began silently in fingers and toes, which is why settlers check themselves often during the night, flexing, rubbing, warming gradually, because numbness was more dangerous than pain, and the absence of sensation was the real warning. The cabin settles into a long, uneasy quiet, not silent, but consistent, and your breathing finds a slower rhythm. And this is where sleep begins to edge closer, not as surrender, but as a truce, and you let your thoughts drift just enough that the firelight behind your eyelids turns into a soft, pulsing glow, while the storm outside becomes a steady background rather than a threat. And you accept that tonight, like so many nights before it, sleep will come in layers, short stretches stitched together by warmth, vigilance and habit, and that for now this is enough. Your sleep never drops straight down into darkness. Instead it hovers, dipping and rising, as the cabin keeps reminding you that rest here is something you participate in, not something that simply happens, and you wake just enough to notice how the fire has changed its voice. The crackle's softer now, embers settling inward, warmth pulling closer to the hearth, and leaving the far corners sharper again. And without fully sitting up, you reach out with your foot, nudging a thicker log closer so that it will catch slowly rather than flare, because pioneers learn to tend fires half asleep, guided more by sound and instinct than sight. As the log catches, a gentle wave of heat moves across your back, and your muscles release a little more tension than before, and you realize how much of the night is spent negotiating with cold inch by inch rather than defeating it all at once, because cold never leaves completely, it waits at the edges, and sleep becomes the art of keeping it there without letting it creep inward. Somewhere near the wall, you hear the faintest whistle again, a seam opening, just enough to remind you that wood is never still, and you pull part of your blanket tighter around your legs, creating a small pocket of warmer air, and this simple act echoes a common winter habit, because settlers often used their own bedding as insulation for the cabin itself, stuffing spare quilts against drafty walls or piling clothing near gaps when chinking failed during storms, sacrificing personal comfort to stabilize the space. You shift carefully, and the platform answers with a quiet complaint, and for a moment you freeze, listening, because unnecessary movement wastes warmth, and you wait until your breathing slows again, and the stillness returns, and this patience, this waiting, is something winter taught well, because rushing rarely improved anything. Once the storm had arrived, the smell of smoke thickens briefly as the log settles, and your throat tightens just enough to pull you closer to waking, and you angle your head lower, closer to the floor where the air is cleaner, a small adjustment that feels automatic now, and you think about how many people learned these tricks, not from advice but from coughing fits in the dark, from eyes burning until tears came, from long nights spent half awake because breathing mattered more than rest. Your toes begin to ache, not sharply, but with a dull pressure that signals heat slipping away again, and you draw them closer to your body, curling slightly, reducing the surface area exposed to cold air. And this posture feels instinctive because it is, and frontier journals describe it again and again. Bodies folded inward like animals conserving warmth, sleep shaped by physics long before it was shaped by comfort. Outside, the wind changes direction, and you feel it immediately as the cabin responds. A slight shift, a soft groan from the roof beams, and your eyes open again, heart beating a little faster until you register the pattern. The same movement you felt earlier, controlled, familiar, and you remind yourself that log cabins were meant to move, that rigidity was the enemy in winter storms, and that flexibility, even when it sounded alarming, was what kept the structure standing. You listen for the animals nearby and hear them breathe, slow and steady, and that sound grounds you more than anything else, because animals react quickly to real danger, and their calm tells you more than any creak or crack, and you let that knowledge settle into you, easing the tightness in your chest, allowing your body to sink back into the layered bedding. Time stretches in a strange way now, minutes blurring together, and you drift in and out of shallow sleep, waking briefly to small sensations, a cooler draft along your ankle, a warmer pulse from the fire, the faint scratch of snow sliding off the roof, and each time you adjust just enough to restore balance, then let go again, and this rhythm becomes the night itself. Adjustment followed by rest, rest followed by awareness. You become aware of how dry your mouth feels, the fire pulling moisture from the air, and you reach for water without fully sitting up, taking a slow, careful sip, because pioneers learned quickly that dehydration worsened the cold, but dry air and smoke stole moisture invisibly, leaving throats raw and bodies slower to respond, and even small sips mattered during long winter nights. As you settle back down, your breath forms a faint cloud that drifts upward and disappears, and you watch it lazily for a moment, fascinated by how quickly warmth leaves the body when given the chance, and you tuck the blanket higher along your chest, careful not to block your breathing, knowing that damp fabric from breath would only turn colder later, and this balance between coverage and airflow feels delicate but manageable now. The cabin seems smaller as the night deepens, not because it has shrunk, but because your awareness has narrowed, focused only on what matters: warmth, air, sound, and the steady presence of others nearby. And you think briefly about how winter nights like this shaped people, teaching them patience, attentiveness, and a quiet respect for small systems that had to keep working together for survival. Your thoughts slow further, becoming less like sentences and more like sensations. The press of blankets, the glow of embers, the low voice of the wind outside, and sleep begins to thicken again, deeper this time, still light, but more continuous, and you allow yourself to drift, trusting that your body will wake you if it needs to, trusting the fire to hold, the walls to bend, but not break, and the night to pass the only way it ever does here, slowly, deliberately, one careful breath at a time. Sometime later you surface again, not fully awake, but aware enough to sense that the cabin has entered a different phase of the night, one where the storm no longer feels aggressive but persistent, as if winter itself has settled in to wait you out. And this shift changes how the space feels around you, because constant cold is easier to manage than sudden cold, and your body seems to understand that before your mind does. The fire has burned down further now, reduced to a quiet bed of embers that glow like distant stars, and the warmth they give is gentler, more localized, which means the rest of the cabin cools gradually and evenly, and that even cooling matters, because sudden drops steal heat faster than steady ones, and pioneers learn to recognize this moment, the point where you decide whether to feed the fire again, or trust your layers to carry you through until morning. You lie still and listen, measuring the cold not by temperature but by sensation, by whether your breath sharpens, by whether your muscles tense, by whether numbness threatens to return. And for now the balance holds just barely, and that is often how winter nights were survived, balanced on a narrow edge between doing nothing and doing too much. Somewhere near the door, a faint rattle appears as wind brushes against loose snow, and you remember that doors were often the weakest point in a cabin, not because they were poorly made, but because wood shrank in the cold and hinges stiffened, and settlers sometimes piled spare tools, firewood, or even furniture against doors at night to add weight and block drafts, turning ordinary objects into part of the insulation system. And you feel the presence of those objects now, silent but purposeful. Your body shifts again on the platform, seeking a position that spreads pressure more evenly, because stiffness has crept into your shoulders and hips, and you know from experience that ignoring it will only wake you more fully later, so you adjust slowly, deliberately, moving only as much as necessary, and the platform responds with a soft creak that fades quickly, a sound you barely register anymore because it has become part of the cabin's breathing. There is a moment when the cold feels almost beautiful, sharp and clean, as you inhale slowly and feel it fill your lungs, and this too appears in old accounts, settlers writing about how winter stripped life down to essentials, how sensations grew stronger, clearer, more honest, when comfort was removed, and lying here now you understand that clarity, even if you would not choose it freely. You tuck your chin slightly toward your chest, reducing the amount of warm air escaping near your face, and you think about how many small habits like this were learned without explanation, passed down through observation. Children watching adults sleep curled inward, hats pulled low, scarves wrapped loosely, movements minimal, and copying those shapes instinctively when the cold pressed hardest. The cabin answers the wind again, with a long, low groan, deeper than before but not alarming, more like a stretch than a complaint, and you feel it through the platform and into your bones, and instead of tightening, your body relaxes into it, because you recognize the sound now. You know it does not mean failure, it means adaptation, wood adjusting itself to survive the night. Your thoughts drift briefly to morning, to light returning slowly through frost-rimmed cracks, to the smell of rekindled fire and the ache in your hands as they warm again, But you let the thought pass because looking too far ahead makes the present heavier, and winter nights are endured best by staying where you are, in this breath, in this moment, in this balance. Sleep returns in a thicker wave this time, not deep and dreamless, but steadier, and you allow it to take you, knowing that you may wake again, knowing that rest here is never final, and yet trusting that each stretch of sleep counts, that each hour survived quietly adds up. The fire continues to glow just enough to mark time. The walls continue to move just enough to hold. The storm continues outside without urgency now, and wrapped in layers of cloth, hide, shared warmth and habit. You drift again, carried forward through the last dark hours of the night, while the cabin does exactly what it was built to do, not defeat the winter but outlast it. You wake again to a subtle change that your body notices before your mind does. A faint easing of pressure in the air, as if the storm has finally leaned back after hours of pushing, and the cabin responds almost immediately, not with silence, but with a different quality of sound. Fewer sharp complaints from the walls and more long, tired sighs from the roof and beams. And this tells you something important, something pioneers learned to read the way sailors read waves, that the worst force of the storm may be passing, even if the cold itself has no intention of leaving. The embers are dim now, barely glowing, and the room feels evenly cold rather than sharply so, and that steadiness is what allows you to stay where you are, instead of rising to feed the fire again, because getting up costs heat, and settlers were always weighing that cost, deciding whether the warmth gained would outweigh the warmth lost in movement. And for now your body decides it will not, choosing stillness instead. You become aware of your breath again, slower than before, deeper, and when you inhale the air no longer stings your lungs the way it did earlier, which tells you the temperature has stabilized, not warm, never warm, but predictable. And predictability is a kind of comfort on winter nights, because it allows the body to relax its constant calculations. Somewhere along the wall, a tiny cascade of ice crystals releases itself, and falls softly to the floor, frost loosening as the interior warms just enough to let go, and the sound is so faint you almost miss it. But you imagine how common this was, how cabins quietly snowed on themselves from the inside during brutal winters, and how people woke to damp patches and glittering walls without surprise, accepting it the way sailors accept salt spray. You stretch one foot cautiously, testing the air beyond your blankets, then draw it back again, satisfied that the cold has not sharpened further, and these small tests become second nature, little checks that happen without thought, because pioneers learned to listen to their bodies at night the way others listened for clocks, measuring time and danger through sensation rather than numbers. The presence beside you shifts slightly, another sleeper adjusting in the shared warmth, and the movement barely disturbs you now, because your body has adapted to this closeness. And there is something deeply calming about knowing that others are enduring the same night, feeling the same cold, sharing the same fire, and that survival here is not an individual effort but a collective one, even in sleep. Outside, the wind no longer howls but moves steadily, brushing past the cabin instead of striking it head-on, and the structure answers with less urgency, its earlier flexing reduced to gentle murmurs. And you think about how many people learn to tell the hour by the wind alone, knowing that storms often broke just before dawn, leaving behind a quieter, colder stillness that felt almost peaceful by comparison. Your thoughts slow again, drifting not toward dreams this time, but toward a kind of blank awareness, a space where you are neither planning nor remembering, just existing within the layered systems that keep you alive. The walls, the fire's last heat, the shared blankets, the careful positioning of your body, and this state feels earned, the result of hours spent responding correctly to small problems before they grew large. You feel the platform beneath you firm and familiar now, no longer an obstacle but a known surface, and you realize how quickly the body adjusts its expectations, how what felt unbearable earlier has become acceptable, even normal. And this too appears again and again in winter accounts, people writing about how hardships softened over time, not because it lessened, but because they adapted. Sleep returns, not suddenly, but like a slow dimming of a lantern, and you allow it to take you again, confident now that the night has revealed most of its dangers, that the cabin has proven itself, and that your own small decisions have added up to something stable enough to carry you forward. And as you drift, the last thing you notice is the quiet, steady persistence of the cold outside, still present, still waiting, but held at bay for now by wood, fire, and the simple, stubborn act of enduring one winter night at a time. You drift for a while in that half-sleep, where time stretches and folds back on itself. And when you surface again, it's not because of fear or noise, but because your body senses the approach of morning long before light confirms it. A subtle shift in the air, a faint thinning of the darkness, and a quiet change in how the cold behaves against your skin, less aggressive now, more settled, as if it has spent itself during the long hours before dawn. The cabin feels different at this hour, heavier somehow, holding on to the last warmth it can, and you notice how the walls no longer creak as often, how the roof has stopped answering every small gust, and this stillness carries its own meaning, because many pioneers wrote that the most dangerous cold often came just before sunrise, when fires were lowest, bodies were tired, and the world paused between night and day, and awareness mattered more than strength. You flex your fingers again slowly, deliberately, checking sensation the way you've learned to do without thinking, and there's stiffness but no numbness, a quiet reassurance that spreads through your chest, and you keep your hands close to your core anyway, because cold has a habit of returning when you assume it won't, and winter never rewards confidence. Nearby, the animals begin to stir more noticeably now, shifting weight, stamping hooves softly, releasing small clouds of warmth that drift through the room, and this movement signals something deeper than sound, because animals respond to changes in light and pressure before humans do, and their restlessness tells you the night is loosening its grip, even if the sun is still hidden. The fire is almost gone now, embers faint and scattered, and you consider feeding it once more, but you don't move yet, because mornings in winter cabins began slowly, cautiously, every action measured against the heat it might cost, and you remember that settlers often waited until first light to rise, conserving what little warmth remained until it could be rebuilt properly. Your breath forms a pale cloud again, and this time it lingers a fraction longer, catching the faintest glow from the embers, and you watch it with quiet fascination, thinking about how many people learn to read their own breath as a signal, knowing when the cabin was warming or cooling simply by how long that mist remained visible, a habit born not from curiosity but necessity. The shared blankets shift as someone else wakes nearby, movements careful and practiced, and no one speaks, because voices steal heat too, and words can wait until daylight. And this silence is not awkward, it's efficient, shaped by countless mornings just like this one, where survival depended on conserving energy until it could be spent wisely. Your thoughts wander briefly to the work ahead, to clearing snow, checking the roof, gathering wood if the storm has left a path open, but you gently pull them back, because planning too early only sharpens fatigue, and pioneers understood this instinctively, focusing first on warming their bodies fully before asking anything of them. You roll slightly, preparing yourself for the moment you'll finally sit up, knowing that the transition from stillness to movement will be the coldest part of the morning, when blood shifts and air rushes into places it hasn't touched for hours, and you brace for it not with tension, but with patience, waiting for the right moment, the moment when the cabin, the fire, and your body all feel ready at once. For now you remain where you are, wrapped in layers, listening to the slow return of life inside the space, the soft sounds of waking, the faint crackle of a dying ember, the distant hush of a storm finally moving on, and you let yourself rest just a little longer, in this fragile calm, knowing the night is not fully over yet, and that winter mornings, like winter nights, are not rushed but earned. You stay still a little longer, because stillness at this hour is not laziness but strategy. And as you lie there, you notice how the cold behaves differently now. No longer creeping, no longer searching, but settled into fixed places like a tide that has reached its mark and decided to wait. And that tells you something else. The pioneers learned without naming it, that the night has spent its energy, even if the danger hasn't disappeared entirely. At last you begin to move, slowly, deliberately, rolling onto your side and then pushing yourself upright in stages. Because standing up all at once in a winter cabin is a mistake people made only once if they were lucky, and the rush of cold that follows sudden movement can steal your breath and leave you dizzy. So you pause halfway, sitting with your feet tucked beneath you, letting blood flow adjust, letting sensation return in an orderly way. The floor greets your feet like stone pulled straight from the earth, shockingly cold, and you instinctively curl your toes and shift your weight from heel to heel, waking them gently, because pioneers knew mornings were when frostbite finished what the night started, if you weren't careful, and many winter injuries happened not in storms but in these quiet transitions from rest to motion. You lean toward the hearth and coax the embers back to life with practiced motions, blowing softly, feeding them thin splinters first, watching for that first small flame to catch. Because morning fires mattered just as much as night fires, not for comfort, but for restoring feeling, flexibility, and breath. And as the flame grows, the cabin responds again, wood ticking softly, frost along the walls beginning to dull and melt in thin lines that trace every imperfection in the logs. Light grows almost imperceptibly outside, not sunrise yet, but the promise of it, a pale grey filtering through cracks and seams, and you realise how much pioneers relied on this kind of light, not clocks or schedules, but the feel of the air and the colour of the dark, and how mornings often began before the sun ever showed itself, because waiting for full daylight meant losing precious warmth and time. As the fire strengthens, the cabin fills with movement again, quiet but purposeful. Blankets folded carefully rather than tossed aside, bedding shaken free of frost and hung briefly near the hearth to dry, because damp fabric became dangerous once the next night arrived. And you notice how each action is economical, nothing wasted, no gesture larger than it needs to be. Your joints ache as warmth returns, a deep, slow ache that settles into knees, fingers, shoulders, and this pain is familiar, recorded again and again in winter journals, people writing about how cold stiffened the body overnight, and how mornings were spent coaxing life back into limbs before real work could begin. And you stretch gently, not forcing anything, letting heat do the work instead. The animals shift more fully now, breath louder, bodies warmer, and their presence changes the air in the cabin almost immediately, adding moisture, warmth, and sound. And this reminds you how mornings blurred the line between human and animal space completely, because everyone needed the same things at the same time: heat, movement, food, and light. You glance toward the door but don't open it yet, because opening the cabin too early invites the cold back in like a guest who never leaves politely, and pioneers learned to build warmth first, to make the interior strong enough to survive the shock of fresh air, and you wait until the fire is stable before even considering it. Outside, the storm has reshaped the land, and you know that without seeing it yet, you can feel it in the way the cabin sits, in the weight against the walls, in the way sound travels differently now, and you prepare yourself mentally for what you'll find: fallen branches, deep drifts, paths erased, work multiplied, but that comes later. For now, you stay inside, feeding the fire, stretching stiff muscles, sharing warmth and quiet movement, letting the morning arrive on its own terms. Because winter taught pioneers one lesson over and over again: that rushing the day never made it easier, and that survival often depended on respecting the slow rhythm of cold wood and human breath. And you remain there, steady, awake now, but not yet done with the night that has not fully released you. You take one more slow breath, and finally allow yourself to rise fully, because now the fire has found its strength again, and the cabin feels awake enough to support movement. And as you stand, You feel how the night has left its imprint on your body, not as injury but as memory, stiffness in the joints, a dull ache in the lower back, fingers that need time before they obey easily, and pioneers recognized this sensation as proof that they had endured rather than failed, because pain meant circulation had returned, and warmth was winning its quiet argument. You move carefully around the small space, stepping where the floor feels least frozen, aware of how every footfall echoes slightly differently now that the storm has settled, and you begin the small rituals that marked winter mornings on the frontier, shaking blankets gently to release trapped frost, brushing ice crystals from hides, laying damp fabric close enough to the hearth to dry without scorching, because moisture was the enemy that lingered after cold moved on, and ignoring it meant starting the next night already behind. As light continues to thicken outside, the walls reveal more of themselves, axe marks catching faint grey highlights, chinking lines darkened where frost melted, and you realize how mornings taught people about their shelters in ways daylight never did, because damage revealed itself honestly after a hard night, showing where the wind had pushed hardest, where heat had escaped fastest, where attention would be needed before the next storm arrived. You pause by the wall near where you slept and press your palm against the logs again, noticing how they are no longer biting cold but merely cool, and this change feels almost miraculous after the long hours before dawn, and it reminds you how pioneers learned patience not as a virtue but as a requirement, because warmth returned slowly and resisted being rushed, and those who respected that pace stayed healthier through the winter. Outside, the first true morning sounds begin to emerge, not birds yet, but the quiet settling of snow, sliding from branches, distant cracks as trees release the night's tension, and you recognize this soundscape as the aftermath of survival, the land itself adjusting after holding its breath for hours, and you feel a subtle alignment between your own body and the world beyond the cabin, both stiff, both waking, both ready to continue. You open the door only a fraction at first, just enough to test the air, and cold rushes in sharp and clean, but it no longer feels hostile, because now you have heat behind you and movement in your limbs, and pioneers often described this first breath of morning cold as bracing rather than terrifying, a signal that the night had not broken them, that they were still capable of meeting the day. The snow outside lies deep and uneven, sculpted by wind into ridges and hollows that erase yesterday's paths completely, and you know that everything done today will take more effort than it would have in summer, that each step will cost more energy, that every task will need planning, and yet this knowledge does not discourage you, because surviving the night has already proven something important, that careful choices and steady effort still work, even when conditions are unforgiving. You close the door again to hold the warmth while you prepare for the day ahead, adding another log to the fire, not for comfort now but for momentum, because winter days began with rebuilding what the night had taken, heat, flexibility, clarity, and you feel that rebuilding happening inside you as well, breath deepening, movements smoothing out, thoughts organizing themselves into something practical and calm. And this is where the story pauses, not ends, because pioneer nights did not exist in isolation. They flowed directly into days shaped by the same cold, the same materials, the same decisions, and what happens next depends on what the morning demands, how much the storm has changed the land, and how prepared the cabin truly is for the next test. And when you're ready, we can step forward together into that next part, slowly, deliberately, just as they did. You linger in that moment a little longer, because winter mornings do not reward urgency, and as the fire settles into a steady burn, you feel the cabin's temperature change almost imperceptibly, warmth no longer clinging only to the hearth but beginning to seep outward, softening the sharpness in the air. And this gradual spread is important, because pioneers understood that bodies warmed too quickly grew careless, while bodies warmed slowly stayed attentive and steady through the hours ahead. You move toward the small table near the wall, its surface scarred and uneven, and set about preparing the first simple task of the day, Not work in the modern sense, but readiness. Checking what remains after the night, counting pieces of firewood, touching stored food to make sure nothing has frozen solid or gone damp. And this quiet inventory shapes the entire day before it begins. Because winter living was never about abundance. It was about knowing exactly what you had and what you could safely use. The smell of warming wood mixes with the faint mineral scent left behind by melted frost, and you notice droplets slowly forming and sliding down the logs, collecting at the base of the walls, and you scatter a little ash there again to absorb the moisture, because dampness that lingered through the day became cold that bit harder the next night, and settlers learned to think one step ahead, always preparing the cabin, not just for the present moment, but for the return of darkness. As the light outside strengthens, shadows inside the cabin grow clearer, and you see the marks left by the storm more distinctly now. Hairline cracks in the chinking, a slight bow in one section of wall that wasn't there before. Nothing dramatic, nothing dangerous yet, but enough to demand attention later. And this is how winter damage usually announced itself, quietly, without spectacle, trusting that those who lived here would notice and respond. You stretch again, slower this time, arms lifting overhead, spine lengthening with a low ache that feels almost welcome now, because movement brings warmth deeper into muscles that were stiff for hours. And you remember how many settlers described mornings as the hardest part of winter days, not because of the cold itself, but because bodies had to be persuaded back into usefulness after long nights of guarded rest. Nearby, others begin to stir more fully, blankets folded and stacked rather than left where they fell, space reclaimed carefully because every square foot matters when weather traps people indoors, and there is an unspoken rhythm to these movements, no one crowding the hearth, no one blocking the door, habits formed over weeks and months of sharing the same small space under pressure. You hear the animals outside now as well, faint sounds carried through the walls, a snort, a shuffle, the scrape of hooves on packed snow, and you make a mental note to check them soon, because livestock health was inseparable from human survival, and pioneers often measured the success of a winter not just by their own endurance, but by whether their animals emerged strong enough to work when spring finally returned. The cabin feels almost peaceful in this early light, not because it is comfortable, but because it has proven itself for another night, and that quiet confidence settles into you too, shaping how you think about the hours ahead, because when the night doesn't break you, the day feels more manageable, even when it promises hard work and cold hands. You sit near the fire for a moment longer, letting heat sink deeper, watching the flames reflect faintly in the metal of simple tools laid out nearby, tools that will soon be cold again once you step outside, and you understand why pioneers lingered indoors longer on winter mornings than any other time of year, building internal warmth before spending it in the open air. Outside, the sky continues to brighten, clouds thinning just enough to let pale light through, and you sense that the storm has truly moved on, leaving behind silence that feels earned rather than empty. And you take another slow breath, steady and calm, knowing the cabin will wait for you, that its walls and fire will be there when you return, and that tonight, when darkness comes again, this entire cycle will begin once more, not as a crisis, but as a practiced ritual of survival, patience and careful attention. You remain inside just a little longer, because winter teaches that the safest moment to step outside is rarely the first moment you want to, and as the fire settles into a steady, confident burn, you feel warmth finally reaching places it couldn't touch during the night, deep into joints and along the spine, and this slow arrival feels earned, like a quiet reward for having listened carefully instead of rushing. You gather what you'll need before opening the door again, gloves stiff from the cold, boots turned on their sides so frost can loosen, a coat that smells faintly of smoke and work, and you shake each item gently, not to clean it but to wake it, because frozen fabric resists movement the way frozen muscles do, and pioneers learned quickly that fighting stiffness only wasted energy they would need later. When you finally lift the bar and open the door, The sound of the outside world rushes in first rather than the cold, a soft, vast hush, snow absorbing every sharp edge of noise, and the air that enters is piercing but clean, the kind that clears your head instantly, and you step just far enough out to read the land without committing to it yet, eyes scanning drifts, fallen branches, the angle of snow against the cabin walls, because this first look tells you how hard the day will be. Snow has packed itself high against the north side of the cabin, forming a dense bank that will need to be cleared, not immediately, but before it can melt and refreeze into ice that pulls moisture into the logs, and you make a mental note of it, understanding why settlers often spent the first part of winter mornings moving snow rather than gathering food or firewood, because a wet cabin became a colder cabin, and a colder cabin turned nights into battles instead of negotiations. You step back inside and close the door again, sealing the warmth, because the day must be approached in stages, and you begin preparing food, something simple and dense, not because you're hungry in a modern sense, but because winter work demands fuel before it demands effort, and pioneers often ate their largest meals early in the day during cold spells, knowing the body burned calories faster just to stay warm. As you eat, the cabin feels fully awake now, light touching every surface, revealing soot-darkened beams, worn tools, and the quiet order that emerges when people live with very little space and very clear priorities. And you notice how nothing here exists without purpose, how even worn objects remain because they still serve, and this practicality seeps into your thinking, trimming away unnecessary worries, narrowing focus to what matters next. Your breath no longer fogs the air as heavily, a small sign that the fire and bodies have finally shifted the balance, and you feel ready now, not eager, but prepared. And there is a difference that winter makes very clear, because eagerness burns fast and preparation lasts. You pull on your coat, feeling its weight settle across your shoulders, and for a moment you pause near the hearth, not out of sentiment, but out of respect, because this fire carried you through the night, and you know you'll be tending it again soon, because winter does not end tasks, it only spaces them out. And as you reach for the door once more, this time with intention, you understand something that every pioneer winter eventually taught, that sleep in these conditions was never just rest, it was part of a cycle of attention, warmth, repair, and patience, and that the night you survived quietly has already shaped the day ahead, even though it hasn't fully revealed how yet. You step outside fully now, boots sinking into snow that has crusted over just enough to resist and then give way, and the sound it makes is dry and hollow, a reminder that the cold still owns this place even if the storm has moved on. And you pause there for a moment, letting your eyes adjust to the open light, because pioneers learned that rushing into the glare after a long dark night could leave you disoriented, your senses lagging behind the world they needed to read accurately. The air feels heavier than it did during the storm, colder but calmer, and you notice how the snow has arranged itself deliberately, piled high on one side of the cabin and scoured almost bare on the other, teaching you exactly which direction the wind favoured during the night. And this matters, because understanding how weather moves around your shelter tells you where the next weak points will appear, where drifting will repeat, where repairs will need to be focused before the next storm arrives. You walk the perimeter slowly, gloved hand brushing the outer logs, feeling how some are rimmed with ice while others are merely cold and dry. And this difference speaks volumes, because ice means warmth escaped there long enough to melt snow before refreezing, and pioneers used this kind of evidence constantly, reading the outside of their cabins the way trackers read ground, learning from what winter left behind. Near the base of the wall, you find a section where snow has packed itself tight against the logs, dense and heavy, and you know it will act as insulation for now, but become a problem later when temperatures rise even slightly, because melting snow seeps into wood and chinking and freezes again at night, widening gaps and pulling heat away more aggressively, and you make another quiet note to clear it once the firewood situation allows. The world beyond the cabin feels vast and silent, trees standing rigid under their white load, branches bowed but unbroken. And you realize how exposed the cabin would feel without them, how much these woods soften the wind and trap snow away from the walls, and you understand why so many early settlers preferred forested land for winter survival, even when clearing it took years of labor. You look back at the cabin now from a few steps away and see it as a whole for the first time since the storm began. Squat and solid, not elegant, but stubborn, built to last not because it is perfect, but because it can be repaired, adjusted, forgiven, and this realization brings a quiet steadiness to you, because survival here is not about never making mistakes, it is about having the chance to correct them. Your breath clouds again in front of your face, and you pull your collar higher, turning back toward the door, because staying outside too long steals heat you'll need later, and pioneers learned to limit exposure whenever possible, stepping out to observe, to work, to gather, but always returning to warmth before the cold could take more than it should. As you step back inside, the door closing softly behind you, the contrast is immediate and comforting, the fire's warmth wrapping around you again, and you feel the rhythm of the day beginning to form, shaped by cycles of inside and outside, effort and recovery, cold and warmth, and you know this pattern will repeat itself until winter loosens its hold. Night after night, morning after morning, each one demanding attention, patience, and the quiet discipline you are still settling into. You move back toward the hearth and let yourself pause there, because winter days, like winter nights, begin best when you listen before you act. And as the fire settles, you feel how the cabin has shifted from survival mode into something quieter, a working calm that makes the space feel usable again rather than merely endured. And this transition mattered deeply to pioneers, because a cabin that felt steady in the morning was one that could support the labor ahead. You crouch and add another piece of wood, not large, not small, something meant to hold rather than blaze, and you watch the flame accept it slowly, because rushing a fire in winter wastes fuel and attention is as precious as warmth when storms are never far away, and as the fire strengthens, the last traces of night stiffness begin to leave your hands, replaced by that familiar tingling that signals blood returning where it belongs. The light outside grows clearer now, filtering through seams and the small window until the cabin no longer feels enclosed but sheltered, and you notice how the interior looks different by day, less threatening, more honest, every flaw visible but manageable. And you think about how many settlers wrote that daylight made even the cold feel more reasonable, not warmer, but easier to face, because danger seen is easier than danger imagined. You sit for a moment on the edge of the platform, boots on, gloves nearby, and let your breathing settle into something steady, and in this stillness you become aware of how tired you truly are. Not the dramatic exhaustion of collapse, but a deep layered fatigue built from hours of vigilance, from decisions made quietly in the dark, from listening more than sleeping, and pioneers knew this tiredness well, accepted it as part of winter rather than a failure of strength. Somewhere outside a branch drops its load of snow with a soft thump, and the sound carries clearly through the cold air, and you instinctively tilt your head, checking, because even in daylight winter demands awareness, and habits formed at night do not disappear with the sun, they simply soften, becoming part of how you move and think without effort. You reach for your gloves and flex them once before pulling them on, waking the leather, and this small ritual reminds you how much winter living is built from preparation done slowly and deliberately, not rushed, not careless, because mistakes in cold weather compound themselves quickly, and pioneers learned to respect that truth with their bodies long before they could explain it in words. The cabin feels warmer now, not because it truly is, but because you have earned that warmth through attention and patience, and you understand that tonight will ask for the same care again, the same listening, the same small choices repeated until they add up to survival. And this thought does not weigh on you, it steadies you, because repetition brings familiarity, and familiarity brings confidence. You glance once more around the room, at the walls that held, the fire that endured, the bedding that did its work, and you know this place will carry the marks of winter long after the snow melts. But those marks are not signs of weakness. They are proof of use, proof of nights like the one you just lived through. And you let that knowledge settle into you as the day begins to unfold, slow and cold and possible. You take another slow circuit of the room. Not because anything is wrong, but because winter teaches you to confirm what you already believe. And as you move, you notice how the cabin holds its warmth a little better now than it did before dawn. The air no longer biting at exposed skin, but pressing gently instead. Firm and cold, but no longer urgent. And this subtle shift tells you that the fire, the repairs and the shared heat have done their work well enough to buy you time. You kneel once more near the sleeping platform and smooth the bedding back into place. Not for neatness, but because order matters in small spaces, and pioneers learned that a tangled blanket or misplaced hide became a problem later when hands were numb and light was low, and it was always easier to prepare during calm moments than to fix mistakes under pressure. As you work, your thoughts drift back over the night, not replaying fear, but tracing patterns where the cold pressed hardest, which seams opened first, how the wind sounded when it changed direction. And this quiet review feels natural, because winter nights were lessons as much as they were trials, and those who survived longest were the ones who learned fastest. You pause at the door again, hand resting on the wooden bar, feeling how smooth it has become from years of use, and you imagine how many hands have done the same thing in moments of hesitation, waiting for the right balance between warmth and necessity, because out there the world remains cold and demanding, and in here there is just enough shelter to think clearly. The fire pops softly, and you glance back, adjusting a log with the tip of your boot, and you notice how easily your body moves now compared to the stiffness of an hour ago. And you recognize this as another small victory, warmth restored not just to skin, but to coordination and judgment. And pioneers valued this feeling deeply, because clumsy hands and slow reactions were dangerous in winter. Light continues to strengthen outside, no longer grey but pale and flat, reflecting off snow and pushing into the cabin through every crack, and with it comes a subtle lift in mood that is hard to explain but easy to feel, a reminder that the night did not last forever, that endurance has an endpoint even if it arrives slowly. You sit down near the hearth again, letting heat reach your back while your face cools, rotating your body occasionally to even things out, and this simple movement feels almost luxurious after the stillness of the night. And you understand why pioneers often lingered by the fire longer than strictly necessary in the morning, because warmth was not just physical, it steadied the mind, smoothing out the sharp edges left behind by hours of vigilance. Outside, the forest holds its silence, broken only by distant settling sounds, snow shifting, branches releasing weight, and you realize that this quiet is not absence but recovery, the land itself adjusting after the storm, and you feel a strange kinship with it, both of you stiff, cold, but intact. You lean back slightly, eyes half closed, and let yourself rest without sleeping, a state pioneers often described as the most peaceful part of winter days, when work had not yet begun, and danger had receded just enough to allow reflection. And you stay there, breathing slowly, grounded in the warmth of the fire and the solidity of the walls, knowing that this pause is not an ending, but a gathering of strength for whatever the cold will ask of you next. You remain there, balanced between movement and rest, because winter living teaches you that momentum is built slowly, and as you sit you become aware of how the cabin itself seems to settle after the long night. The logs no longer protesting, the roof quiet, the air steady enough that you can finally stop listening so hard, and this easing feels earned, like a nod of approval from the shelter that carried you through the storm. You rise again and begin small tasks that feel almost ceremonial in their simplicity, stacking firewood closer to the hearth so it will be within reach when darkness returns, setting tools back where hands will find them automatically later, And these actions are not about productivity, they are about reducing future decisions. Because pioneers understood that fatigue does not come from work alone, it comes from constant choice. And winter demanded that you save your clarity wherever possible. As you work, the smell of the cabin changes again, smoke fading, damp wood warming, a faint sweetness from drying branches, and you realize how closely scent guided people here, how changes in smell warned of smoke build-up, hidden dampness, or poor airflow long before instruments or measurements existed, and you breathe slowly, cataloguing the air without thinking about it. You step near the wall where frost had traced its delicate lines earlier, now gone, and you run your fingers along the seam, feeling where the wood has tightened again as the interior warms. And this movement reminds you that nothing in winter stays fixed for long, not temperature, not materials, not even your own body, and the only constant is adjustment, gentle and repeated. The light outside grows brighter, pushing its way into the cabin more confidently now, and with it comes the faint suggestion of sound beyond snow and wind, a distant bird perhaps, or the creak of a tree shifting under weight. And these sounds feel like signals rather than noise, telling you that the world is still functioning, still moving forward despite the cold. You find yourself thinking again about the night, not with dread but with curiosity, noticing how each challenge arrived quietly, how none of it was dramatic in the way stories often make it seem, and you understand that pioneer survival was rarely about moments of crisis, and far more often about long stretches of attention, patience and humility before conditions that could not be controlled. You sit back down once more, not from exhaustion but from habit, letting the warmth reach you fully before you step out again. And in this pause you recognize something important. That sleep in a winter cabin was never separate from the rest of life. It was not an escape or a break, but another form of participation, another task woven into the same rhythm of care and awareness that shaped every hour. And as the day continues to open itself slowly outside, pale and cold and demanding, you stay exactly where you are for a moment longer, grounded by the fire, steady in your breath, ready to move when the time feels right, knowing that the night you survived has already taught you how to face whatever comes next, and that the cabin, imperfect but faithful, will be waiting when darkness returns again. You finally stand and stretch, every muscle slow to wake, each joint reminding you that warmth comes gradually to a body that has learned to conserve rather than expend. The air is sharper now that you've moved away from the hearth, but it no longer feels like a threat, just an element to work with, a familiar presence in the routine that follows survival. You pull on your coat, worn but dependable, the same one that brushed against rough wood and snow hours ago, and it feels heavier now, soaked faintly with moisture, but still a barrier between you and the day. When pioneers began their mornings after a storm, they did not speak of victory. They spoke of continuation. The fire, the walls, the breathing of animals, all of it was simply one more line held against the wilderness that pressed from every direction. You sense that same realism settling over you now. Outside the light brightens, grey giving way to something paler, and through the window slit you can see the world reshaped again. Snow dunes curve against the tree trunks, and the path you cleared yesterday has vanished, smoothed perfectly by the storm's long hand. The horizon looks clean, unbroken, as if no human effort had ever existed here at all. You push the door open, and the hinges resist slightly, metal contracting in the cold. The first breath of air that hits your face smells of pine and wood smoke and a faint mineral sharpness carried by ice. It feels ancient, honest, and alive. You step outside carefully, boots crunching into the untouched surface, the sound loud in the silence. There's something holy in that sound, something that every settler must have felt at least once, stepping into a world both brutal and beautiful, knowing the line between safety and danger could change within an hour. You walk toward the woodpile, inspecting it automatically. The top layer is crusted with ice, but beneath it the logs remain dry. Each piece represents work already done, hours traded for heat that hasn't yet been spent. Pioneers measured time this way, in cords of wood, in the thickness of smoke, in how long it took frost to form on the inside of the walls again. You lift one piece, test its weight, and carry it back toward the door, feeling the old rhythm returning. Lift, balance, breathe, step. Back inside, you rest the wood near the hearth and crouch to feed the flames again. Sparks jump, eager, and the smell of burning oak replaces the thin scent of frost. The cabin responds the way a living thing does when tended. It groans softly, breathes deeper, exhales warmth into your face. You stay there, hand outstretched, feeling the air change, listening as ice melts somewhere unseen, dripping faintly onto the floor. This is the moment every pioneer learned to trust, the slow assurance that life continues when you give it just enough attention. The night will come again, and the storm will return, but for now the fire holds, the walls stand, and the silence outside has turned from warning into peace. You sit back on the platform, draw your coat closer, and let yourself rest, not to escape the day, but to honour it. The storm has passed, the cabin remains, and so do you. You sit quietly, watching the fire rebuild itself one spark at a time, and the small orange light on the stones feels almost ceremonial, an offering to the day after a night that demanded everything. The air shifts again, softer now, touched by the faint scent of warming sap from the logs, and as the heat moves through the cabin, you realize how much you've begun to listen to these invisible transitions, how survival here depends less on effort and more on sensitivity. You turn toward the small window where daylight has become pale gold, diffused through a crust of frost that glows faintly like stained glass. The outside world is almost motionless. Snow glitters where the sun touches it, and a column of smoke from the chimney rises straight upward, thin and steady, an old sign of good weather, something settlers once took as quiet permission to rest or travel. For now, you take it as a promise of stillness. You stand again, stretch your arms slowly, and notice how your shadow trembles across the rough-hewn walls. The marks of the axe that shaped each log catch the light, each groove holding a small memory of the hands that built them. In another age, these walls might have been temporary, something to last a season until a better house could be built. But winter has a way of making temporary things permanent. You move to the door and open it carefully. Only a crack, enough for the cold to slip in and greet you like an old acquaintance. Outside, the forest breathes in silence. A crow lifts from a distant branch, its cry brief and hard, the first living sound of the morning. You step out and let your boots sink into the untouched snow. It squeaks, brittle, and beneath that noise, there's nothing, no wind, no motion, just stillness vast enough to feel like a held breath. Pioneers wrote of mornings like this with reverence, calling them God's reprieve, moments when the world paused between hardships. You understand that now. The storm that threatened to take everything has left behind a purity so complete it almost feels undeserved. You take one long breath, feel it crystallize in your chest, and let it go slowly, watching it drift upward and vanish. The cabin stands behind you, small but defiant, its roof lined with white, its chimney breathing steady smoke. Every surface gleams under frost, every imperfection turned beautiful by the light. You think about how fragile it looked last night, how easily a few wrong choices could have undone it all, and yet it endured, as so many cabins did, built by people who believed that survival was a matter of persistence, not perfection. You step back inside and close the door. The latch clicks softly, the fire answers with a sigh, and for a moment the whole world feels contained within these walls. You know that the day will bring work, wood to cut, ice to break, repairs to make, but not yet. For now, this quiet warmth is enough. You sit down again by the fire, fold your hands, and simply listen. The cabin creaks once, the snow outside settles, and the light continues to grow. It is morning in the frontier, and against all odds, life begins again. You lean back against the wall, feeling the faint vibration of the wind pressing outside again, not fierce now but steady, like a long, slow breath. The cabin answers with its own rhythm, timbers expanding, air shifting, the quiet popping of the fire as resin escapes the wood, and you realise that this small structure, built in haste and held together by nothing more than muscle, instinct and faith, has become a living thing in its own way. The light outside has grown brighter, clearer. Sunlight cuts across the floor in a thin, slanted band, catching the dust and smoke in its path, turning them into tiny, swirling stars. You watch it move slowly up the wall as the day advances. For the pioneers who came before you, this was the closest thing to a clock, the sun marking time in glances, not in hours, measuring how long warmth would last before the next cold fell. You reach for the kettle near the hearth, the metal cool against your fingers, and pour a little water from the snow you melted earlier. The sound it makes as it hits the hot stones is small but comforting. A hiss, a reminder that even the simplest acts in winter are deliberate victories. Steam rises, curling in the air, and you cup your hands around it, letting the warmth touch your face. You think about how those who lived this life measured success, not in comfort, but in continuity. Another night survived, another fire lit, another morning where frost could melt instead of deepen. Each day like this, ordinary yet immense, was a quiet act of defiance against the cold, a promise renewed again and again until spring returned. Outside, the forest begins to move in slow ways that only winter allows. A small gust shakes loose powder from the branches. A squirrel darts between drifts, its fur nearly blending into the snow. You imagine how settlers learned to read these signs, the way animals behaved, the way snow fell, to sense when the weather was changing before the sky had even shifted. Nature spoke constantly to those who cared to listen. You close your eyes for a moment, feeling the heat on your face and the solid cold pressing through the walls at your back. The two forces meeting and balancing right where you are. This is what survival felt like here. Not triumph, but equilibrium. No victory song, no feast, just the knowledge that for now the balance held. You open your eyes again, and the world feels steady. The storm has passed, but winter is far from finished. You know that tonight will come with new challenges. Fresh wind, deeper cold, the endless cycle that shapes every life lived at the edge of wilderness. But for now the cabin is warm, the fire is strong, and the air smells faintly of smoke, clay, and the lingering breath of those who refuse to yield. You take another deep breath, slow and quiet, and let it fill the space. The day stretches ahead, pale and bright, and though the cold waits patiently beyond the door, you no longer fear it. You have learned its language. You stay there a long while, sitting by the hearth, listening to the quiet conversation between fire and wind. The day has become still, the kind of stillness that only comes after a storm when the world seems to exhale, and in that silence you realize that nothing in this cabin, not the walls, not the fire, not even your breath, is wasted. Everything here has a purpose. You look around at the marks left behind by the night. Frost melted into dark streaks on the wood, ash gathered thick around the hearth, a single crack in the chinking where cold managed to slip through. These imperfections tell the story better than words ever could. They are proof that the night was hard, but not impossible. Proof that human hands can build something that endures. Outside, the light changes again. The sun climbs higher, scattering across the snow, until the world looks almost unreal, all silver and white. You open the door one last time and stand in it, half inside, half out, and the air that meets you is clean and sharp, carrying the faint scent of pine. The wind is gentle now, brushing past your face like an old friend rather than an adversary. For a moment you imagine the generations who did this before you, the farmers, trappers, mothers and children who woke after nights just like this one. Each morning they rebuilt what the cold had tested. Each winter they learned again that survival wasn't a single act of courage, but a steady rhythm of attention and endurance. You understand them now. You've lived their pattern. You take a final look at the cabin, the smoke rising straight and thin, the rough logs silvered by frost, the roofline strong against the bright sky. It is not grand, Not even comfortable by modern measures, but it stands, and in standing, it has given you something no warmth could ever buy, a sense of quiet belonging to the season itself. You close the door, hear the latch fall into place, and return to the fire. The flames are steady now, burning clean, the colour of old honey. You lower yourself onto the platform, feeling the wood's familiar unevenness beneath you, and let the warmth crawl gently back into your bones. Outside, the snow gleams brighter. Inside, the last shadows of the storm fade away. You know night will come again, and the wind will find the cabin's weak points once more. But now you also know that you'll be ready. For tonight, for tomorrow, for every winter that waits beyond the trees, the cabin will stand, and so will you.